Story 1. The Rise of the Lion, the Early Life of Mansa Musa. You find yourself at the edge of the Sahara, in a world long before cars or clocks, where the sun dictates time, and the sound of camel hooves is the heartbeat of commerce. You're in West Africa, sometime in the late 13th century, in the shadow of a rising power. The Mali Empire is not yet a golden legend, it is a growing ambition. In this dust-bound land, the rivers are lifelines. The Niger, winding and vast, cuts through the Sahel like a thread of silver in a brown tapestry. Villages dot the banks, some made of mud brick with thatched roofs, others of woven reeds. This is a world where oral tradition reigns. There are no grand libraries yet. History lives in the mouths of griots, storytellers whose memories are the libraries of a people. Musa Keita, the boy who would become the richest man in history, is born into this world. But he is not born to power. He is a prince, but not the first in line. His birth name, lost to time in many records, is believed to have included Keita, tying him to the royal clan of the Malinke people. His family are the heirs of Sundiata Keita, the lion prince who defeated the sorcerer king Suminguru and established the foundations of the Mali Empire. But the throne does not pass simply by blood. Power here is earned, appointed, sometimes gifted through strange twists of fate. Musa's childhood is quiet by imperial standards. He is likely educated by local scholars, learning Arabic script and Quranic verses if his family is already Islamic in practice. Islam, at this point, is spreading not by conquest but by commerce. The gold and salt trades link Mali to North Africa and the Mediterranean world, and with these goods come new ideas, languages, and customs. Musa grows up hearing traders speak in Mande, Arabic, Berber, and even Songhai dialects. The empire is linguistically rich and politically complicated. But daily life is not filled with glory. A boy like Musa might spend hours tending livestock, learning how to manage people and provisions. He watches the elders resolve disputes in long, drawn-out palavers under the shade of the she tree. He hears the beat of the talking drum before the message it carries arrives by mouth. He learns when to speak and when to listen. What is overlooked in the legends is that Musa likely spent a great deal of his early years in the company of commoners, herders, traders, guards, and griots. His understanding of empire began not with grand councils, but with listening to stories by firelight and observing the structure of village life. Who had power, who did not, and why? At the same time, larger forces moved around him. The Mali Empire in the late 13th century was a patchwork of peoples, cultures, and territories held together by a mix of tribute, military enforcement, and spiritual authority. The core of its strength was the control of trade routes: salt from Tagheza, gold from Bambuk and Bure, and slaves from war captives. These goods moved along caravan routes policed by imperial patrols, routes that tied together a continent through shifting sands and whispered names. Then came the fateful moment, perhaps the most boring, yet significant event in Musa's early life. The Emperor Abu Bakr II, or Mansa Musa, a ruler fascinated by the ocean, reportedly embarked on a mysterious expedition. He set sail with a vast fleet to explore the Western Sea, never to return. Musa, still young but of royal blood, was appointed as deputy ruler, perhaps because he was not yet powerful enough to pose a threat, or because he was competent enough to be trusted. Either way, his elevation was administrative, not glamorous. This strange interim period, while the emperor chased myths of the Atlantic, was the hinge of Musa's fate. He took control of the empire not through war or inheritance, but because someone else left the seat warm. Here, the story pauses in a land of waiting. Musa waits for news that never comes. The people wait for a ruler who will not return. The empire waits for someone to step into the vacuum. And so we're left with a question. What sort of ruler is made in the shadow of another man's dream? And what happens when he finally takes the throne? When the fleet did not return, neither after months nor after years, it was clear. The emperor was lost to the sea. The West African court, like many royal systems, could not function indefinitely without a leader. A deputy, no matter how dutiful, was not a king. And yet Musa, still holding the title of deputy ruler, had quietly taken control of the day-to-day affairs of the empire. The capital did not burn, the caravans still ran, and tribute still flowed from outer provinces. Musa's reign had begun not with a coronation, but with a continuation. He was not, by all accounts, a dramatic figure, at least not yet. He was efficient, quiet, focused. He reorganized the court with little ceremony, preferring practicality over pomp. Some say he expanded the administrative class, empowering scribes and advisors, many of whom were learned in Islamic law. This was a subtle but significant shift, a blend of traditional Mandé customs with growing Islamic jurisprudence. To understand how Musa ruled, you must first understand what Mali was: not a city-state, but a vast and uneven empire stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of the Sahel. It was a federation of sorts, held together by loyalty, tribute, fear, and geography. Roads, though not paved in stone, were well-traveled sand routes guarded by imperial patrols. Border provinces often had their own kings, called farbas, who paid tribute and recognized the supremacy of the Mansa, but operated semi-independently. Musa's first task was to stabilize these outer regions, not by brute force, at least not always, but by recalibrating the empire's incentives. Tribute was reaffirmed, gifts were exchanged, loyalty was tested. By appointing relatives and trusted advisors to regional posts, Musa slowly tightened his grip over the empire without drawing blood, or at least not much of it. His second challenge was economic. The empire ran on gold, but not in coins. Gold dust was the standard currency, measured in small pouches and traded in tiny quantities. Merchants carried scales with them to weigh the dust during exchanges. A pound of salt could cost several ounces of gold in some regions, while in others, cowrie shells still held value. There was no uniform economy, but Musa saw the need to formalize what he could. He began to centralize control over the gold mines, particularly in the Bambuk and Bura regions. These were not the open-pit mines of modern times, but rather networks of shallow shafts, dug by hand and supported by wooden frames. Laborers, often enslaved or semi-free, extracted the ore with primitive tools under brutal conditions. Musa didn't invent this system, he inherited it, but he organized it more efficiently. Records were kept, production was monitored, taxes were enforced. The gold then moved northward, often on camel caravans led by Berber traders, crossing the Sahara to feed the economies of North Africa and beyond. Gold from Mali ended up in the hands of Venetian merchants, minted into Florentine florins, and eventually reached the markets of Cairo, Damascus, and even distant Europe. Musa understood this invisible thread, that Mali's power wasn't just territorial, it was monetary. And while Mali itself didn't mint coins, its control over the raw material of wealth gave it leverage far beyond its borders. Still, the capital, likely Niamey, remained modest by imperial standards. A riverside settlement with earthen buildings, it housed the royal court, a military garrison, and several markets. The air smelled of shea butter and smoke. Markets bustled with trade: kola nuts, ivory, iron tools, textiles dyed with indigo. Scribes worked in shaded courtyards, transcribing trade documents in Arabic script. And yet, outside of Mali, few knew the name Musa. At this point in his rule, Musa was barely a rumor in foreign courts. The Islamic world knew of Mali, sure, but it was considered a far-off land of pagan kings and gold traders. That perception grated at Musa. He was not merely a tribal chief or local governor. He was a sovereign ruler Mansa of a massive empire and a devout Muslim. And he was about to make sure the world knew it. In the year 1324, nearly 2 decades into his rule, Musa prepared for the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj. But this was no private journey. This would be the most extravagant pilgrimage the Islamic world had ever seen. Musa planned meticulously. The logistics were staggering. The journey would span thousands of kilometers across desert and sea. Reports say he brought with him a caravan of 60,000 men, including slaves, courtiers, soldiers, merchants, and attendants. He was accompanied by hundreds of camels, each carrying hundreds of pounds of gold. At least 500 slaves, each bearing a gold staff, walked beside him. His entourage stretched the length of a small town on the move. The Mansa was no longer a shadow behind the throne. He was now a symbol, and that symbol was gold. But the caravan was not just about wealth. It was also a calculated political and religious maneuver. Through this pilgrimage, Musa would announce his devotion to Islam, forge diplomatic ties with other Muslim leaders, and reshape how the Islamic world perceived the West African frontier. As the journey began, whispers spread along the trade routes. Who was this African king with such wealth? What would the Mansa do when he reached the centers of learning and power? Cairo, Medina, Mecca. Musa had spent much of his life consolidating quiet power. Now, for the first time, he would step into the global spotlight. And so the caravan moved eastward across savannah, through desert, into history. But as the golden procession crossed into Egypt, it would create shockwaves that would echo for centuries. How does a king's devotion accidentally destabilize an economy and rewrite the world's idea of Africa? It was 1324 when Mansa Musa entered Cairo, but the story of that moment echoes far beyond that year. The Egyptian Sultan, Al-Nasir Mohammed, was no stranger to visiting dignitaries, but nothing had prepared him or his court for the arrival of a West African king trailing an empire behind him. The streets buzzed with rumors of a caravan that glittered under the sun, of camels too tired from the weight of gold to walk upright, of servants dressed in fine brocades, and of a ruler so rich that he made gold seem worthless. By the time Musa entered Cairo, his reputation had preceded him. Eyewitnesses described a man of grace, modest in speech but extravagant in act. When asked about his wealth, Musa responded with the kind of disinterest that only someone drowning in gold could afford. He gave alms with ease, handed gold to the poor, to merchants, to officials, and to religious scholars. He donated heavily to Cairo's mosques and Islamic institutions. In just a few days, the balance of Cairo's economy would begin to tilt. Gold prices plummeted. The markets so long accustomed to gold stability were suddenly flooded. The value of gold in Egypt dropped by nearly 25%, causing a regional economic crisis that would take over a decade to recover from. Musa had not come to destabilize, he had come to give. But in doing so, he revealed a paradox. Too much wealth, even in the hands of the generous, can become a burden. This unintentional act of inflation remains one of the only known cases of a single individual directly affecting a national economy on this scale. And yet, despite this disruption, Musa left Cairo adored. He was not seen as a vandal or invader, but as a nobleman from the unknown West, an embodiment of the ideal Muslim king, pious, learned, and benevolent. After his time in Cairo, Musa continued his pilgrimage to Mecca. He prayed at the Kaaba, he visited scholars, he studied with theologians, he left donations in his wake, and where he walked, people listened. But the Hajj wasn't just spiritual, it was geopolitical. In the Islamic world, political legitimacy often flowed from religious observance. To be known as a devout Muslim ruler, particularly one who had performed the Hajj, was to be elevated. In this way, Musa's journey was a signal flare. It told the world, Mali is not a land of pagan kings. It is a Dar al-Islam, a house of Islam. Its rulers are learned and its wealth is real. On the return trip, Musa brought more than memories. He returned with architects, engineers, poets, and scholars. One of the most famous was Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a Granada-born architect and poet whom Musa commissioned to help build mosques and monuments in Mali. Though sometimes mythologized beyond historical fact, al-Sahili's influence helped formalize architectural design in imperial Mali, especially in Timbuktu, Gao, and Niamey. Back in Mali, the pilgrimage changed everything. Timbuktu, a city on the fringe of the desert, had long been a trading post. Under Musa, it was transformed into a center of Islamic scholarship. The Sankore University was expanded, its mosque rebuilt, and its library filled. Thousands of manuscripts were copied texts in theology, law, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. Students traveled from across West Africa to study there. For a moment, Mali stood at the intellectual edge of the Islamic world. Timbuktu's mud-brick buildings, baked in the sun and carved with intricate detail, became icons of the empire's cultural maturity. These were not the pyramids of Egypt, but they were no less enduring. Practical, organic, and shaped by climate, they stood as a testament to knowledge made local. Musa did not stop at one city. He commissioned mosques across the empire, in Gao, in Niani, in Jen. These were more than places of worship, they were signs, symbols, markers of an empire that blended Islamic identity with West African roots. But empire is fragile. In the years following Musa's death, sometime around 1337, the cracks began to show. His successors lacked his vision or authority. Regional rulers pushed for independence. The gold fields remained, but the political structure weakened. As the Songhai Empire began its rise, Mali's influence receded. Cities like Gao, once loyal tributaries, broke away. Still, the legend of Mansa Musa lingered. In 1375, he appeared on the Catalan Atlas, a map created in Majorca by Jewish cartographer Abraham Cresques. There, Musa is depicted seated on a golden throne, wearing a crown, holding a scepter in one hand and a solid gold nugget in the other. He is identified simply as Rex Meli, King of Mali. This map became one of the most important medieval documents in Europe, and for many Europeans, this was their first image of sub-Saharan Africa, not as a jungle, but as a kingdom of gold. But here lies the irony. As Musa's fame spread across the world, his empire quietly shrank. And yet, the story of Musa never vanished. Oral traditions kept his name alive long after Mali's fall. In Senegal, Mali, Niger, and Guinea, griots still speak of the king whose generosity caused a market crash, who walked across the desert to Mecca, who brought architects from Andalusia and books from Cairo. His story survives not because of conquest, but because of consequence. Even today, Mansa Musa is remembered less for war than for wealth, less for laws than for learning, less for palaces than for pilgrimage. He didn't found Mali. He didn't conquer Egypt. He didn't build monuments visible from space. And yet, he is now considered the richest man who ever lived, a title often repeated in modern lists but rarely understood in its full historical weight. So what did Musa truly leave behind? He left a blueprint of soft power, of influence built not just on armies, but on ideas. He showed that an African empire could shape global markets, create centers of learning, and define spiritual legitimacy in a wider world. And perhaps most importantly, he left us this quiet truth: that the most enduring legacies are not always forged in war, but in the long, slow movements of gold, words, and prayer across the sand. Story 2. Gold dust and camel caravans, trade routes of the Mali Empire. You stand at the edge of the desert, in a place where the wind sculpts sand into waves that look like the sea. Nothing grows here, no trees, no rivers, not even the shadow of a bird. But this barren expanse, the Sahara, was once the beating heart of West Africa's economy. There were no roads, no signs, no maps carved in stone. And yet trade moved slowly, carefully, inevitably along the invisible paths drawn by memory and passed on by word of mouth. These were the trans-Saharan trade routes, the arteries of an empire, and the means by which gold, salt, ivory, slaves, and ideas flowed for centuries. Before Mansa Musa became legend, and long before Mali was a household name, there were caravans. Hundreds of camels tied nose to tail, guided by Berber nomads and Tuareg tribes, crossing the sand in long, deliberate lines. Each step was measured, each route memorized through generations. No one used a compass, not yet. The stars, the wind, the skeletons of failed travelers marked the way. But these weren't just random trails. They were part of a complex and highly coordinated network that spanned over 2,000 miles, connecting West Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean world. From Timbuktu and Gao in the south, to Sijilmassa, Tuet, and Taghaza in the north, the flow of goods followed a seasonal rhythm. The commodities that moved empires. Two items dominated these routes more than any other: gold and salt. Gold came from the Bambuk and Bura regions, deep in the forests south of Mali's heartland. It wasn't mined in grand tunnels or explosive quarries. Instead, it was gathered through panning and shallow digging, extracted by laborers using wooden pans and baskets. Dust and nuggets were filtered from muddy streams and slowly accumulated into the stores of village leaders, merchants, and royal agents. Salt, by contrast, came from the north from dry, barren salt mines like Taghaza, where workers hacked bricks of salt from the ground with crude tools. These salt slabs, sometimes weighing over 80 pounds each, were loaded onto camels and sent south. In regions without refrigeration or refrigeration technology, salt wasn't just seasoning, it was preservation, currency, and even tribute. In many towns, salt was so valuable that it was traded pound for pound with gold. In between these two extremities, gold to the south, salt to the north, lay the true genius of the trade, the Malian cities that acted as middlemen. Timbuktu, Jen, Walata, and Niani were not merely way stations. They were economic engines, processing centers, and cultural hubs. Taxes were collected on goods entering and exiting. Warehouses stored ivory, cola nuts, dyed fabrics, iron tools, even ostrich feathers and leather. Some goods continued north. Others remained, traded in the local markets, their value adjusted by season, scarcity, and risk. Every transaction was watched. Royal inspectors, called farbas in some sources, monitored trade routes and enforced tribute from local rulers. The empire didn't just profit from trade, it controlled it. Traders paid tariffs, soldiers guarded caravans, and imperial law punished fraud. This administrative system allowed for remarkable stability over vast distances. The human thread. The caravans themselves were not faceless. They were led by Berber and Arab merchants, often operating in family groups or guilds. These traders were part economist, part diplomat, part survivalist. They memorized water points, negotiated with bandits, and knew which oases had drinkable water or which ones were traps of brackish disappointment. Travel was done in stages, often at night to avoid the desert heat. By day, tents were pitched and the camels rested. Supplies included water, skins, dates, dried meat, and sometimes small jars of oil for cooking. Fires were rarely lit, wood was scarce, and the desert was indifferent to human suffering. The journey from Mali's interior to the Mediterranean could take 2 to 3 months, sometimes longer. Death was common. Camels collapsed. Men died of thirst. Sandstorms swallowed paths whole. But the prophets were too good to resist. Traders who survived one journey often came back richer than princes, if not in gold, then in the stories they could sell. And still, the most precious cargo wasn't metal or mineral. It was knowledge. Books traveled. Ideas traveled. From Cairo to Mali came news of Islamic theology, architecture, astronomy, and mathematics. From Mali to North Africa came oral histories, new forms of poetry, and accounts of great rulers. This exchange built the foundations for Mali's later universities, particularly in Timbuktu. But more on that in a later story. The role of the state. The Mali Empire didn't invent these routes, but it perfected the system that protected them. Under Mansa Musa and his predecessors, caravans were given military escorts. Banditry was punished. Water points were sometimes enhanced with guards or basic infrastructure. In some cities, wells were dug, and the availability of grain and fodder for camels was monitored to keep traders returning. Mali's kings appointed governors over trade cities, managed tax collection with surprising sophistication, and reinvested wealth into institutions. In doing so, they created not just a trade empire, but an economic ecosystem where survival, cooperation, and long-term planning were rewarded. The merchants also operated under a kind of informal guild code. Disputes were often settled without violence. Contracts could be made orally, but witnesses were expected. Islamic law, Sharia, began to take root alongside local customs, providing a framework for resolving conflict and enforcing contracts. Over time, trust became a tradable commodity just as valuable as gold. And then there were the slaves. It would be incomplete to speak of these trade routes without acknowledging the human toll. Slaves were a constant presence in the caravans, some as cargo, others as laborers. Captured during military campaigns or bought in inland markets, they were transported north to be sold in markets from Fez to Cairo, or employed within Mali's own farms, mines, and royal courts. This part of the trade was often quiet, unnamed in records, but omnipresent. The invisible roads. Despite all this movement, no monuments mark the old trade routes today. The desert has reclaimed most of it. Bones crumble, salt melts, maps fade, but the economy built on these roads changed the world. It connected the wealth of sub-Saharan Africa with the Islamic world and, indirectly, to Europe. It laid the foundation for the myth of Africa as a land of gold and riches, a myth that would later fuel European exploration, colonialism, and conflict. It also connected disparate peoples through shared religion, economic interest, and cultural exchange. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was only possible because these trade routes existed, and his empire thrived not because of conquest alone, but because of logistics. The boring logistics of camel caravans, the slow movement of salt, the weighing of gold dust in the palm of the hand. There was no internet, no ships, no telegraph, just a caravan, a camel, and the stars overhead. And yet, what happens to a world built on invisible roads when the stars no longer guide? The wells run dry, and the merchants stop coming. You wouldn't expect it, but in a place where sand threatens to swallow everything, some cities bloomed like quiet flowers. They weren't built of marble or raised in celebration. Their walls were made of mud, their roofs from wood, and their stories kept not in books but in the mouths of travelers, traders, and scholars. And yet, these cities, Timbuktu, Jen, and others, were the economic and cultural engines of the Mali Empire's vast trade networks. Let's begin with the most famous, Timbuktu. Today, its name is shorthand for the middle of nowhere, but once it sat at the heart of everywhere. Timbuktu was never the largest city in the empire, nor its political capital, but it became a vital commercial and intellectual center. Located where the Niger River meets the Sahara's southern edge, it served as a natural junction between West African trade goods and Saharan merchants. A city of markets. The marketplace in Timbuktu was rarely quiet. Merchants sold salt bricks stacked like stone, bales of cotton, bundles of dried fish, and gourds filled with shea oil. The smell was rich, part sweat, part spice, part smoke. And then, of course, there was gold dust. It was kept in small pouches, often tied at the waist. Traders carried their own scales, delicate brass balances measuring with care, adjusting the weights slowly, blowing on the scales for luck or superstition. Gold was not minted here. It was weighed and trusted. Timbuktu's success came not only from goods, but from its systems. Imperial officials collected tariffs on goods entering and exiting the city. Tax collectors worked alongside scribes, often writing in Arabic, documenting the weight of goods and the identity of traders. The records were rarely kept on scrolls or in large ledgers. More often, they were copied by hand, stored in personal libraries, or passed along verbally. Contracts and negotiations happened not in courts but in open squares, under the watchful eyes of elders and guards. Jen, the sister city. Roughly 400 kilometers to the southwest lay Jen, Mali's other commercial jewel. Jen was older than Timbuktu and more deeply rooted in local traditions, particularly animist religions and indigenous crafts. But like Timbuktu, It evolved into a trading hub for salt, gold, and slaves. Djenne's layout followed the Niger's flood rhythms. The city would often be surrounded by water for part of the year, giving it a natural moat. The people of Djenne adapted their architecture accordingly, using mud brick known as banko, a blend of mud, rice husks, and water dried in the sun. This material was cheap, sustainable, and remarkably durable if maintained. In fact, the Great Mosque of Djenne, one of the most iconic structures in Africa, still stands today rebuilt in the early 20th century in the traditional style. Markets in Djenne were not as vast as Timbuktu's, but they were deeper in local integration. Farmers traded yams, millet, and onions. Fishermen brought catfish and eels. Local artisans sold dyed cloth, hand-woven mats, and leather sandals. Djenne was more Malian in character than Timbuktu, which always felt like a city leaning toward the Arab world. The quiet backbone, regional cities. While Timbuktu and Djenne shine brightest in the historical memory, dozens of smaller towns dotted Mali's trade routes. Towns like Walata, Kabara, Niani, and Kumbai Sale played essential but overlooked roles. Walata was a Saharan border town, acting as a transfer point between caravans entering Mali and those heading north. It was a caravanserai town rows of low-slung buildings, dusty courtyards, and stables. Kabara served as Timbuktu's port, where goods were loaded and unloaded from canoes that moved along the Niger River. The river was the silent highway of the empire. Niani, believed to be the empire's political capital under Mansa Musa, was less commercial but deeply administrative, housing royal granaries, scribes, and the king's own court. Each of these cities had its own rhythm, its own roles. The people who lived in them didn't always think of themselves as Malian. Some were Saninke, Fulani, Songhai, or Bozo. They were connected more by economy and opportunity than by ethnicity. And yet through trade, language, and religion, a shared culture began to form. Knowledge is commerce. As trade intensified, so did another form of exchange, ideas. In Timbuktu especially, a shift occurred. Traders began bringing books, religious texts, philosophical treatises, legal writings. These were hand-copied manuscripts, some imported from Cairo or Fez, others copied locally. Mosques such as Sankore, Jingreber, and Sidi Yahya transformed into learning centers. They weren't universities in the modern Western sense, but they trained scholars in law, theology, grammar, and astronomy. A thriving manuscript culture developed. Wealthy families began to collect books as status symbols. Owning a large library became a sign of power, much like owning land or livestock. Some manuscripts were richly illustrated. Others were simple, bound in leather and wrapped in cloth. Today, tens of thousands of these manuscripts still exist hidden in private homes, stored in clay jars, or housed in dusty libraries. But why did knowledge become so important? Because Islamic law and trade went hand in hand. Merchants needed to understand contracts, interest, inheritance, and debt under Sharia. Religious scholars often acted as judges, mediators, and scribes. A merchant who could read Arabic, cite hadith, and understand Islamic jurisprudence had an advantage not just spiritually, but economically. Over time, the scholar became as powerful as the soldier. The spiritual economy. Islam spread slowly in Mali. It didn't arrive by the sword, it arrived on the back of camels, in the hands of merchants, and in the teachings of marabouts traveling Islamic scholars and mystics. These teachers integrated local beliefs with Islamic customs, creating a hybrid spiritual culture. You might find a mosque with geometric Saharan design built beside a sacred baobab tree worshipped for generations. In the markets, people might perform Islamic ablutions, then offer a coin at a shrine for ancestors. The syncretism wasn't political, it was practical. It was survival. It was Mali. Friday prayers echoed in the mosques, but sacrifices to forest spirits continued. This was not hypocrisy, it was balance. Administration and taxation. Behind all this commerce and culture stood the slow, boring machinery of empire. Customs officials sat at city gates, recording the weight of salt, the size of caravans, the origin of textiles. Scribes kept tallies in worn books. Guards patrolled the markets, settling disputes and punishing theft. Merchants paid sales taxes on luxury items and land use fees if they set up tents for more than a few days. Foreign traders required permits, often granted after long deliberation. These weren't standardized systems, but they were effective, backed by the authority of the Mansa, enforced by local governors, and supported by the implicit threat of imperial force. Trade created prosperity, but it also built a network of accountability that allowed Mali to function across such an enormous distance. As the sun set over these cities, the markets closed and the call to prayer echoed through narrow alleys. The scent of spice and sweat lingered. Somewhere, a caravan entered the gates and a new journey began. But while trade brought wealth and books brought knowledge, both were fragile. What happens when the caravans are disrupted? The cities fall silent, and the libraries are locked away, forgotten beneath the dust they once defied. At first, it was hard to notice. The merchants still arrived, though perhaps a few fewer than the season before. The gold still moved, though its dust was now clumped with moisture, not as fine. The camels still crossed the desert, but now some were thinner, some with less cargo. There were still scribes, still taxes, still calls to prayer, but the rhythm had changed. Trade empires, like the rivers they rise beside, don't collapse overnight. They dry up slowly. And so it was for the Mali Empire and the trade routes that once gave it life. Winds of change. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the mighty caravan system began to show signs of stress. Several subtle but powerful shifts converged. Political fragmentation. After Mansa Musa's death in 1337, his successors struggled to hold the vast empire together. Power fractured. Provincial rulers asserted independence. The once vital administrative web began to fray. Tax collectors operated with less supervision. Some cities stopped sending tribute altogether. Mali still had gold but less control over where it went. The rise of Songhai. To the east, in the city of Gao, the Songhai people were building their own power base. Under leaders like Sunni Ali and later Askia Mohammed, the Songhai Empire began to overtake trade centers like Timbuktu and Jen. These cities didn't resist hard. Trade cities care more about commerce than kingship. If power shifted peacefully, so did their allegiance. Drought and desertification. Climate doesn't announce itself, it creeps. Periodic droughts affected the grasslands that fed the camels and cattle of caravan travelers. Water points dried up or moved. Routes became less predictable, more dangerous. Without food and water, a caravan could not move. Entire routes were abandoned or rerouted. The desert was not a passive backdrop, it was a powerful force of resistance. European disruption. Around the same time, European explorers began sailing down the Atlantic coast of West Africa. Portuguese ships reached Senegal and Guinea in the mid-1400s. These seafarers didn't come across the Sahara, they went around it. They traded directly with coastal peoples, bypassing the overland routes altogether. Slowly, the camel gave way to the ship. What once took months by sand could now be done in weeks by sea. The trans-Saharan trade wasn't dead, but it was dying by degrees. What the collapse looked like. In Timbuktu, the shift was not dramatic. The markets still operated, the scholars still taught, but gradually books became harder to obtain. Manuscripts weren't copied as frequently. Imported goods grew more expensive. Some caravans didn't return. The wealth that had once poured through the city became a trickle. Patrons stopped funding mosques. Libraries were neglected. Scholars migrated to other centers, some to Morocco, others to the Sahel. Families who had stored their wealth in books now stored it in silence. In Tagheza, the salt mines continued briefly, But the workers mostly enslaved suffered even worse conditions as demand dropped and support systems collapsed. Without regular trade, Tagheza became untenable, eventually abandoned and replaced by Taoyuideni, farther north. But even that could not recapture the glory of the past. Caravanserais, those sand-colored rest stops that once dotted the Sahara, fell into disuse. Wells filled with sand. Oases lost their strategic value. Some towns vanished entirely, consumed by wind and time. The roads beneath the sand became just sand again. The shift to the coast. As the old routes declined, coastal trade centers rose. Ports like Elmina in modern Ghana began to flourish under European control. Instead of gold passing north by camel, it was now shipped west then north by sail. The Atlantic slave trade, in its horrific and enormous scale, would eventually replace the more localized systems of slavery that had existed within trans-Saharan commerce. This marked not just an economic transition, but a civilizational shift. Control of gold, salt, and people passed into foreign hands, and where there had once been a proud empire with its own roots, cities, and systems, there were now outposts, colonies, and extractive economies. Echoes in the dust. But history never vanishes entirely. Today, in Timbuktu, the remains of the old mosque still stand. The Niger Mosque, with its wooden stakes protruding like teeth, still hosts prayers. The Sankore University is no longer a center of world scholarship, but local scholars still study and preserve ancient manuscripts, often by candlelight, in rooms no larger than closets. Thousands of medieval texts covered in dust, written in careful Arabic script, remain hidden in private collections, passed down by families who remember that once, long ago, books were more valuable than gold. In Jen, the great mosque is replastered every year in a communal ritual. Entire neighborhoods come together to smooth the mud walls, a tradition going back centuries. It is not trade but memory that sustains these places now. And across West Africa, the oral traditions endure. Griots still speak of Mansa Musa, the caravan kings, the camel trains, the cities that sparkled like stars. They tell of roads no longer walked but never forgotten. The roots are gone, but the idea of the roots of connection, exchange, movement remains, in the architecture, in the books, in the bloodlines. So as you picture the Golden Empire, don't imagine thrones or armies. Imagine instead the slow movement of salt across a dune, the soft jingle of gold dust in a leather pouch, and the quiet negotiations beneath a reed-roofed stall. Trade built Mali. Trade unbuilt it. And yet, what stories lie buried beneath those dunes, still waiting for someone to listen and remember and walk the old roads again? Story 3, a pilgrimage like no other, Mansa Musa's journey to Mecca. You wake to the sound of footsteps in sand, thousands of them. Camels groan. Brass bells jingle softly. The air smells of leather, grain, and dust. It is 1324, and you are standing along the road from Niani, watching the largest caravan the world has ever seen pull itself like a slow, gilded serpent through West Africa. This is no ordinary pilgrimage. This is Mansa Musa's Hajj, a journey of over 4,000 kilometers to the holy city of Mecca, across the Sahara, through Cairo, along the Red Sea, and into the heart of the Islamic world. But it's not just a religious journey, it's a declaration, a performance, a display of wealth and power the world would never forget. And yet behind the spectacle, this is still a journey of faith. Why the Hajj? Islam had been growing in West Africa for centuries, carried by Berber traders and marabouts. By Mansa Musa's time, Islam had become both a religion and a tool of statecraft. It offered a unifying language, Arabic, a legal system, Sharia, and access to powerful economic and scholarly networks stretching from Fez to Delhi. For rulers like Musa, performing the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, was not only a personal spiritual duty, it was a strategic act. It placed him on equal footing with the sultans of Egypt, the caliphs of Baghdad, and the Marinid emirs of Morocco. It told the Muslim world, Mali is not isolated. Mali is not primitive. Mali is Islamic, imperial, and immensely rich. But Musa would not go alone. The caravan assembles. Historical accounts vary, but all agree. This caravan was enormous. 60,000 people, including slaves, soldiers, courtiers, merchants, griots, cooks, camel drivers, and servants. 500 slaves, each carrying a gold staff. 100 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold. Thousands of pounds of food supplies, millet, rice, dates, dried meat, and water skins. Tents made of fine Egyptian cloth, sandalwood from the forest regions, and rugs woven in local and imported styles. Personal doctors, Islamic jurists, scribes, and imams accompanied the emperor. The logistics were astounding. This wasn't just a procession, it was a moving city. They needed water, fodder, protection, and places to rest. Routes were carefully chosen, passing through friendly territories or regions where Mali's influence was respected. Advance envoys were likely sent ahead to prepare lodging and ensure local markets could accommodate the sudden demand for food and shelter. Every few days the caravan stopped. Fires were lit. The night filled with quiet prayers and slow songs. Somewhere in the center, Mansa Musa, cloaked in fine fabric, consulted with his advisors and prayed in the direction of the rising sun, toward Mecca. This journey would take nearly a year, across changing landscapes, through danger, heat, and exhaustion. And yet, it would transform both Mali and the Islamic world's understanding of Africa forever. Crossing the Sahara. No part of the journey was more treacherous than the Sahara Desert. 1,000 miles of shifting sand, heat that blistered skin, and the ever-present risk of losing your way. Here, the caravan relied on Berber guides, whose knowledge of oases, stars, and seasonal winds made survival possible. Water was rationed. Camels were fed salt to keep them hydrated. Travelers wrapped their heads in cloth, not for fashion but for life protection from sunstroke, sandstorms, and wind. At night, temperatures dropped drastically. Fires were built and stories were shared, tales of Mansa Musa's kindness, his authority, his wealth. But the desert was indifferent. Many fell sick, some died. Camels collapsed under the weight of gold and goods. The caravan paused, mourned, then moved on. The caravan crossed through Tuat and Sijilmassa, key Saharan cities where salt and gold were traded. From there, it entered Egypt, and the city of Cairo a place of bustling markets, towering mosques, and elite scholars. And this is where the world first truly saw Mansa Musa. The arrival in Cairo. The Egyptian Sultan, al-Nasir Mohammed, did not know what to expect. Reports had trickled in of a West African king traveling with unimaginable wealth, but rumors are easy to dismiss. What entered Cairo, however, could not be ignored. Thousands of men, dressed in finery, filed into the city. Camels laden with gold stirred up crowds. Musa handed out gifts to poor Egyptians, scholars, and merchants, sometimes so much that the value of gold plummeted across the region. Cairo would suffer from this economic ripple for over a decade. He gave massive donations to mosques, schools, and hospices. Scholars were stunned. Merchants were dazzled. Diplomats were eager to forge ties. The Sultan himself invited Musa to meet him, but Musa, adhering to Malian court custom, initially refused to bow before another monarch. Eventually, protocol was navigated. Musa appeared before al-Nasir not as a supplicant, but as an equal. Their meeting was cordial, respectful, and layered with political calculation. Musa was, after all, representing a sovereign empire, not a distant province. But beyond diplomacy, Musa's time in Cairo had other impacts. He commissioned builders and architects, including the famed Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, to accompany him back to Mali. He purchased rare books, engaged with legal scholars, and established intellectual ties with the great institutions of Islamic law. He likely recruited scribes, teachers, and artists to enrich his empire culturally, not just economically. It is easy to focus on the gold, but Musa's true gift to Mali was not financial, it was institutional. He brought back knowledge, systems, and people that would help define Mali's golden age. Mecca and the completion of the Hajj. After Cairo, the caravan continued through the Sinai Peninsula, into the Hijaz, and finally to Mecca. The Hajj itself, circumambulating the Kaaba, praying at Mount Arafat, participating in the rituals, was conducted with solemnity and devotion. For all his opulence, Musa was still a believer. He is said to have given further alms in Mecca and Medina and met with influential theologians. Unlike the spectacle in Cairo, Musa's time in Mecca was quieter, more personal, and deeply spiritual. He was not here as a king, but as a man. In the crowds of pilgrims, he was one among many, rich, yes, but ultimately equal before God. The caravan rested, prayed, and prepared for the long return. But something had shifted. Mali's name was now etched into the consciousness of the Islamic world. The man from the Golden Empire had arrived, and in his wake, nothing would be the same. And so the caravan turned west again. But this time, it would not return empty-handed. What happens when a king brings home not just gold, but new ideas, new institutions, and a vision of empire shaped by faith and strategy alike? The journey back to Mali was quieter. Not in terms of logistics, the caravan still groaned under the weight of goods, gold, people, and camels, but in its purpose. Mansa Musa had completed the Hajj. He had prayed at Mecca. He had met with sultans, gifted gold across Cairo, and placed Mali firmly on the map of the Islamic world. He had seen the cities of Egypt, touched the Kaaba, and spoken with scholars whose names were quoted across centuries. Now he returned with a new kind of cargo. It wasn't gold or salt. It wasn't ivory or slaves. It was ideas. And ideas, if properly planted, are heavier than gold and harder to control. A caravan of change. As the procession crossed back through Egypt, then the Sahara, it had grown. Mansa Musa had not just bought goods, he had hired people. Among them, Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a poet, scholar, and architect of Andalusian origin, often credited though sometimes mythologized with shaping the architectural landscape of Mali. Islamic jurists and scholars, who would assist in establishing systems of Islamic law Sharia across the empire. Artisans trained in architecture, calligraphy, mosaic design, and manuscript production. Scribes fluent in Arabic, who would help formalize documentation and court correspondence. This wasn't just a return, it was a reinvention. Musa had seen a world far larger than Mali. In Cairo, he had observed a complex, bureaucratic empire supported by learning, trade, diplomacy, and religion. In Mecca, he had stood shoulder to shoulder with believers from across the Islamic world. His empire, while wealthy, had not yet matched the administrative sophistication of the Islamic centers he had visited. But now he intended to change that. A golden homecoming. Upon returning to Niani, Musa was welcomed not just as a king, but as a man touched by the world. Stories of his generosity in Cairo had already reached Mali. Merchants and griots carried tales of a ruler who made gold cheap in Egypt, who built mosques with foreign architects, and who gave alms by the handful. But Musa didn't simply bask in legend. He immediately began to build. First, he turned his attention to Timbuktu, already a thriving trade hub but lacking in institutional infrastructure. With his new advisors and builders, he oversaw the construction of the Niger Mosque, commissioned in 1327, a structure of sun-dried mud brick and wood, beams, one of the most enduring symbols of Islamic West Africa. The expansion of the Sankore Mosque, which would evolve into a full-fledged university, one of the earliest of its kind in the world. Public infrastructure projects in Djinn, Niani, and other key towns. These were not grand marble temples. They were functional, practical, and adapted to local materials and climate. Al-Sahili and his team did not simply import Arab architectural design, they blended it with Sahelian tradition, producing what is now known as Sudano-Sahelian architecture. Thick earthen walls, wooden Toron beams, tapered minarets, and forms sculpted with natural curves rather than rigid lines. The buildings became symbols of faith, but also of knowledge. The intellectual renaissance of Mali. More than bricks and mortar, Musa brought home a new vision of learning. Under his guidance, the Sankore University in Timbuktu expanded its teaching staff. It taught Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, logic, astronomy, grammar, medicine, and mathematics. Manuscript production increased. Scribes copied texts in Arabic, some imported, others original works of West African scholars. Families began to collect libraries. Books became a form of currency, more precious than livestock or gold in some circles. Judges trained in Islamic law were appointed in provincial courts. Disputes could now be settled using a combination of local custom and Sharia. Learning, once informal and oral, was now written, structured, and institutionalized. The image of Mali as a land of gold now evolved into something deeper, a land of knowledge, a center of Islamic scholarship far from Arabia, yet entirely within its spiritual orbit. Islam and indigenous belief. Mansa Musa's embrace of Islam was sincere, but not destructive. He did not demand the eradication of local customs. Instead, Islam in Mali coexisted with indigenous beliefs. Ancestral rituals continued alongside mosque attendance. Rainmakers, griots, and spirit healers still played roles in society. Conversion was often gradual and voluntary, particularly among elites and merchants who benefited from the economic ties that Islam brought. This syncretism made Mali resilient. It allowed Islam to take root without resistance, slowly blending with local cultural practices. And yet, under Musa, the empire took on a clear Islamic identity not just in faith, but in its courts, education, architecture, and international diplomacy. A new international image. In the decades after his return, Mali's reputation skyrocketed. In 1375, Mansa Musa appeared on the Catalan Atlas, drawn by European cartographers who had never visited Mali but heard tales of his riches. He is shown sitting on a throne, wearing a golden crown, holding a solid gold nugget in his hand, labeled simply as Rex Mel, King of Mali. Mali became associated with immense wealth, faith, and order. This attracted more merchants, more diplomatic contact, and more intellectual attention from the Islamic world. Mali, once a peripheral empire in the eyes of Arabs and Europeans, was now on the mental map of the world. And all of this renaissance of identity, this surge in prestige, this architectural and academic flowering began with a man who walked across the desert in pursuit of faith. But even as the empire flourished, a question hovered. What happens when the man behind the vision is no longer there to guide it? Mansa Musa died sometime around 1337, quietly and without fanfare. The exact details of his passing are, like much of pre-modern West African history, lost in the erosion of time and the fluidity of oral tradition. No grand mausoleum marks his resting place, no carved epitaph tells the final chapter. And yet, his legacy lived on in buildings of sun-baked mud, in libraries of careful script, and in the memory of the world that he had stunned with his wealth and humbled with his faith. But empires are delicate things, especially those built around the gravity of a single figure. The successors. After Musa's death, his son Magha assumed the throne. Musa had prepared for this, appointing Magha as deputy during his absence on the Hajj, a model he had followed when serving under his predecessor, Abu Bakr II. Magha continued his father's policies. He kept trade flowing, maintained relationships with Islamic scholars, and preserved the intellectual life of Mali. But he did not have Musa's vision. The pilgrims had returned. The gold had been spent. The books remained, yes, but without the force of Musa's personality, the institutions he founded began to drift. Not collapse, but slowly lose the cohesion and clarity they once had. Later successors, such as Mansa Suleiman, Musa's brother, were able rulers particularly adept at stabilizing court finances and maintaining diplomatic connections. But each generation moved slightly farther from the radiant moment of Musa's pilgrimage and slightly closer to fragmentation. Tensions grew among vassal states. Ambitious generals saw opportunity. Foreign observers, once dazzled, began to hear rumors that the empire was weakening, that tribute no longer flowed reliably from the southern provinces, that the Songhai people to the east were gaining strength. And yet, the structures Musa built didn't vanish. Mosques remained. Niger still summoned the faithful every Friday. Books survived. The libraries of Timbuktu were guarded as family heirlooms. Markets thrived. Gold and salt continued to flow, though sometimes less predictably, sometimes under a new banner. Mali's reputation abroad. Even as the empire slowly declined, Musa's legend grew. In Europe, his image on the Catalan Atlas, 1375, became a symbol not only of African wealth, but of a mysterious and powerful black monarchy. To European audiences, Africa was often imagined as a land of monsters and deserts. Musa changed that narrative. He was presented as regal, rich, and sovereign. The nugget in his hand wasn't just literal, it was metaphorical. It represented the West African interior as a place of unimaginable wealth. This reputation would prove a double-edged sword. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Portuguese explorers sailing down the Atlantic coast were driven, in part, by legends of Musa and his Golden Empire. Chroniclers like Alvise Cadamosto recorded tales of Mali and Timbuktu, further stoking European desire for contact, control, and conquest. Musa had helped put Africa on the map literally and figuratively, and soon, outsiders would come looking for what he had shown the world. The fade of the caravans. One of the first cracks in Musa's empire was the gradual loss of control over the trans-Saharan trade routes. The Songhai Empire, once a tributary of Mali, rose in power under Sunni Ali and later Askia Mohammed. Timbuktu and Gao cities Musa had invested in were eventually absorbed into Songhai's expanding domain. The routes through Taghaza, Tuat, and Walata became contested, harder to tax and harder to protect. Mali was no longer at the center of the exchange. It was still part of it, yes, but its days of dominance were waning. Yet, unlike many empires that collapse in fire and ruin, Mali's decline was slow, quiet, and civilizational. The empire didn't fall in a day. It simply faded as desert winds reclaimed roads, as rivers shifted course, as alliances changed. Legacy of the Hajj. It's tempting to view Musa's Hajj through the lens of luxury, the gold, the slaves, the grand procession, but that would be to miss its deeper meaning. His pilgrimage was more than a statement of wealth, it was a reorientation of Mali. He turned his empire toward the Islamic world, embedding it in legal, intellectual, and spiritual traditions that would shape West African identity for centuries. He invested in education, ensuring that his people had access to books and ideas, some of which would still be copied and preserved hundreds of years later, even during colonial rule. He introduced architectural forms and administrative systems that outlived his reign, forming the basis for later West African kingdoms. And perhaps most profoundly, he left behind a cultural memory. In Mali, griots still sing of Musa's pilgrimage. In Senegal and Niger, his name remains synonymous with greatness. In modern imagination, He's often called the richest man who ever lived, a dubious title in terms of economic precision, but one that reflects how vast, how mysterious, and how powerful his empire once seemed to the outside world. The long shadow. There is no golden palace to remember Mansa Musa by. No massive tomb or monumental statue. But the Niger River Mosque still stands, weathered but strong. And Timbuktu's manuscripts, though threatened by time, neglect, and war, are still preserved in vaults, hidden rooms, and digital archives. His story, scattered like gold dust across history, still sparkles in unexpected places. And so, the man who walked across the desert returns again and again, in our telling, each time reappearing in the questions we ask. How do you lead with both faith and power? Can wealth serve wisdom or consume it? And what happens when a single man's journey redraws the boundaries of the known world, only for the world to forget his footsteps in the sand? Story 4. The economics of excess, inflation in Cairo. Cairo was no stranger to wealth. In the early 14th century, the city pulsed as the vibrant heart of the Mamluk Sultanate. It was a hub of Islamic scholarship, political power, and commercial exchange. Minarets pierced the skyline, calls to prayer echoed through dense alleys, and the scent of spice, leather, and ink filled the air. Cairo stood at the intersection of East and West, welcoming caravans from sub-Saharan Africa, ships from India, and envoys from across the Mediterranean. And then one day, the world's richest man walked in and broke the economy. His name was Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali. His caravan had crossed the Sahara with tens of thousands of people, hundreds of camels, and tons of gold. By the time he reached Cairo in 1324, the city was about to witness something that would bewilder its economists, intrigue its scholars, and puzzle historians for centuries. The man had come to pray, but he would also spend. And in doing so, he would alter the flow of Egypt's economy for more than a decade. The price of piety. When Musa arrived, he did not enter like a stranger. Reports say he entered modestly, initially refusing to meet Sultan al-Nasir Mohammed until proper diplomatic protocols were followed. But his caravan had already captured Cairo's attention. He carried so much gold and gave away so freely that word spread faster than his camels could walk. He gave gold coins and gold dust to the poor. He handed out lavish gifts to officials, scholars, and court attendants. He bought luxury items and paid generously, sometimes extravagantly, for accommodations and goods. His entourage spent freely in souks, purchasing everything from textiles and perfumes to books and horses. At first, the generosity was celebrated. After all, what merchant complains when a customer pays double or triple what an item is worth? But quickly the celebration turned to concern, then to confusion, and finally to inflation. Gold becomes common. The value of gold, like anything, depends on scarcity and perception. For centuries, gold had been the backbone of currency systems across the Islamic world. Its stability made it ideal for long-distance trade, tax collection, and savings. Cairo's dinar was respected for its purity, often used in transactions as far away as India and Venice. But when Musa entered the market and flooded it with raw gold, the value of the dinar began to drop. Not overnight, but quickly enough that contemporaries took notice. The 14th century Arab historian and scholar al-Umari, writing years after Musa's visit, reported, "So much gold was current in Cairo that it lost much of its value. Its price fell and kept on falling for about 12 years. This wasn't a mild fluctuation. By some estimates, the price of gold dropped by 20–25% across Egypt. That's an astonishing level of deflationary shock for a pre-modern economy. Gold had become common, abundant, ordinary. And that broke the very mechanism by which Cairo's financial stability functioned. The ripple effect. The effects of this monetary flood were far-reaching. Savings devalued. People who had stored their wealth in gold suddenly found their life savings worth less. Merchants who had held gold reserves for years saw their purchasing power shrink. Imported goods more expensive. As gold lost value locally, foreign merchants demanded more gold for the same products. Cairo's trade deficit grew. Certain luxury goods became harder to obtain. Wage imbalances. Some workers demanded payment in non-devalued commodities, such as grain, textiles, or livestock. The money economy became more volatile, less predictable. Government revenue unstable. Tax collectors found it harder to assess fair values. The state's gold-based revenues weakened, requiring adjustments to tax policy and payment systems. The Egyptian economy did not collapse, but it wobbled. It would take over a decade for the gold market to recover its equilibrium. Some scholars even argue that Cairo's long-term monetary policies were altered by the memory of this golden flood, leading to tighter controls on coin minting and reserve practices in later decades. Musa's role, intent vs. impact. Did Mansa Musa intend to destabilize an economy? Certainly not. He was, by all accounts, a pious Muslim ruler fulfilling one of the 5 pillars of Islam. His generosity was not performative, it was a spiritual obligation. Giving alms, zakat, was required of him, and as a king, he felt it appropriate to give greatly. To deny a beggar, or to haggle with a merchant, would have seemed not only rude but spiritually bankrupt. And yet his gifts came from a land where gold was plentiful, and where it was not yet fully integrated into monetary systems. In Mali, gold was weighed, not minted. It was stored as dust, not coins. Its use as everyday currency was limited. So Musa may not have fully grasped the structural impact of distributing so much of it in a sophisticated monetary economy like Cairo's. He gave to honor God, but he inadvertently triggered a financial anomaly. A rare historical case. Historians often point to Mansa Musa's impact on Cairo as one of the only recorded instances where a single individual's personal spending caused macroeconomic inflation across a national or regional economy. Modern economists, like those at the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, have occasionally used Musa's pilgrimage as a case study, a medieval cautionary tale of how monetary supply shocks can destabilize an entire region. And yet Musa remains admired. Cairo's historians never depicted him as an invader or manipulator. If anything, he was remembered with awe, a king from a distant land whose faith matched his fortune, and whose actions, though disruptive, were never malicious. His arrival was a miracle, his departure a memory. And the gold, eventually it was reabsorbed into the system. Coins were melted, reminted, rebalanced. Life moved on. But the event was never forgotten. So what does this story tell us? It tells us that wealth is not neutral. It has gravity. It changes behavior. It distorts systems. Even generosity, when delivered without understanding, can be a kind of weapon. And it leaves us with a deeper question. What does it mean when generosity shakes a world not with force, but with the weight of too much gold? The gold didn't vanish, it settled. It lingered in the folds of Cairo's silk, in the grain markets of Fustat, in the pockets of scholars and camel drivers, street vendors and imams. Mansa Musa's gold entered everything, and in doing so, it quietly distorted the normal rhythms of economy and human behavior. This was not an invasion, nor a conquest. There were no armies, no treaties signed under duress. And yet, Musa's pilgrimage altered Cairo's economy with the silent force of abundance. The gold was beautiful, it was pure, but there was simply too much of it. An economy reacts. Cairo in the early 14th century was no backwater. It was the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, a sophisticated state that ruled Egypt, the Levant, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. The Mamluks, originally slave soldiers from the Eurasian steppes, had risen to rule one of the Islamic world's most powerful and wealthiest empires. Its economy was vast, built on agriculture from the Nile floodplains, tax trade from the Red Sea, and the bustling markets of Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo. And still, it was vulnerable to disruption. Mansa Musa's sudden gold influx drove prices up, but not uniformly. Luxury items soared in cost as sellers realized buyers from Musa's caravan were willing to pay more, often far more. Gold itself dropped in value, meaning people needed more gold to buy the same goods as before. Some traders began to hoard goods, anticipating that prices might rise even further. Others began to manipulate weight measurements, demanding more gold dust for goods once sold cheaply. The result was what modern economists would call price instability. Markets became less predictable, buyers hesitated, sellers overcharged. Wealthy families tried to convert their assets into land, spices, or textiles, commodities less affected by the sudden flood of metal. The Sultan responds cautiously. Sultan al-Nasir Mohammed, ruler of Egypt at the time, was an experienced politician. He'd ruled in multiple stints and had faced rebellions, Mongol threats, and internal court rivalries. The appearance of Mansa Musa was both a gift and a puzzle. On one hand, Musa's pilgrimage gave Egypt international prestige. Hosting such a powerful, devout, and wealthy Muslim king enhanced the Sultan's image across the Islamic world. On the other hand, his spending distorted the economy, and Mamluk officials struggled to respond. Coinage became a central issue. Egypt minted dinar, gold, and dirham, silver coins. But with gold flooding in from Musa's caravan, the dinar's value fluctuated wildly. Money changers who sat in Cairo's markets and handled daily currency exchange had to recalibrate constantly. To restore balance, the Sultan's treasury may have adjusted the weight and fineness of coinage, increased silver minting to offset gold's instability, restricted large-scale transactions in gold to protect the public from further fluctuation. These are not just theoretical measures, they reflect the kinds of monetary tools used by Mamluk authorities during periods of currency strain, as seen in similar disruptions before and after Musa's visit. And yet, there's no record of Musa being blamed for the disruption. Instead, his impact was framed as an anomaly, a curious event, a story to tell, a cautionary tale of riches without restraint. Economic memory, a tale retold. Decades after the event, Arab historians like al-Makhrizi and al-Umari continued to write about the effects of Mansa Musa's visit, not as gossip, but as historical insight into the fragility of wealth. Al-Umari, in particular, presents Musa as both awe-inspiring and disruptive. His writings reflect a mixture of admiration and analytical distance, trying to make sense of how a single man through religious devotion could cause lasting economic ripple effects in one of the world's major cities. To understand how unusual this was, consider this. Most economic disruptions in the medieval world came from wars and invasions, like the Mongols or Crusaders, natural disasters, plagues like the Black Death, crop failures and famines. But this came from pilgrimage. Mansa Musa broke the system not by burning cities or hoarding food, but by giving too much. A religious obligation, fulfilled too lavishly, caused a marketplace to tilt off its axis. That contradiction made his visit unforgettable. The paradox of abundance. Gold is one of history's most enduring symbols of stability. It does not rust. It does not rot. It cannot be eaten, worn down by weather, or bred like livestock. It's rare, beautiful, and chemically inert, and for most of history it has served as the ultimate store of value. But Musa's pilgrimage proved a hard truth. Even gold in excess becomes a problem. The lesson Cairo learned perhaps too late was that wealth is only as useful as the systems that contain it. Without proper regulation, gold becomes a flood, not a foundation. Without restraint, generosity becomes instability. Without balance, even sacred acts can undermine order. And Musa, for all his wisdom, had not foreseen the consequences. Perhaps he couldn't have. His empire was flush with gold. His people used it differently, more as tribute and prestige than formal money. He stepped into Cairo's market with his own assumptions, shaped by a different economic logic. In doing so, he misread the system and overwhelmed it. A financial aftershock that lingered. The aftereffects of Musa's pilgrimage outlasted him. Egypt's monetary recovery took over 10 years, a long time in an age where coinage shaped not just markets but tax policy, military provisioning, and state revenue. Even long after the dinar stabilized, the memory of the disruption remained. Merchants spoke of the year the gold fell. Scholars cited it in theological debates about wealth and ethics, and future rulers were reminded power must be paired with understanding. In time, the stories turned into myth. Musa's caravan was remembered not just as a display of wealth, but as a force of nature, like a flood, like a storm, like something beautiful and dangerous all at once. But behind that beauty was a system strained to its limit, and a city that had to learn to rebalance slowly, patiently, and with no clear villain to blame. Just too much gold. And so we're left with this thought. If even the world's most stable commodity can shake an empire, then what truly holds value in a world constantly shifting under the weight of power, piety, and perception? Long after Mansa Musa left Cairo, long after the gold was spent, melted, and reminted, his shadow remained. It wasn't in the accounts of merchants or the ledgers of tax officials. It lived in stories. It echoed in European imaginations, Islamic scholarship, and even in maps drawn decades later, far from the deserts his caravan had crossed. What Mansa Musa unintentionally created was an economic legend, one that would reshape the global perception of West Africa for better and later for worse. Let us trace the long shadow of a single economic event, the arrival of a king, the giving of gold, and the ripple that turned into a myth. A global whisper, Africa as the land of gold. The world had long heard rumors of Africa's riches. Ancient Egyptians traded with Nubia for gold. Carthaginians had sailed down the Atlantic coast. Berber caravans had carried stories of black kings and golden lands into the mosques of North Africa. But it was Mansa Musa who turned rumor into confirmation. In 1324, when his golden pilgrimage passed through Cairo, people didn't just see gold, they saw gold in the hands of Africans, given freely, worn proudly, and carried in such quantities that it seemed to flow from the earth. To the merchants of Cairo, Mali became a place of inexhaustible wealth. Musa had not come as a supplicant or a trader, but as an equal, or perhaps even a superior. He didn't need to bargain, he had enough to give. He didn't need to ask permission, his arrival was announcement enough. And Cairo, for all its sophistication, was stunned. Arab chroniclers like al-Umari and al-Makrizi spread Musa's story far and wide. Though Musa had returned to Mali, his name remained alive in scholarly circles, often as the gold-rich king from the far west. Over the next few decades, that story traveled to Morocco, to Al-Andalus, and eventually to Europe. The Catalan Atlas and the birth of a myth. In 1375, over 50 years after Musa's Hajj, a Catalan Jewish cartographer named Abraham Cresques drew one of the most famous medieval maps of the world, the Catalan Atlas. In the middle of West Africa, far from the Nile, Cresques placed an image of a black king seated on a golden throne. He is robed in finery, crowned, and holding a gleaming nugget of gold in one hand. The caption reads, This black lord is named Mansa Musa, king of Mali. He is the richest and most noble lord of all this part of Africa due to the great quantity of gold that is found in his lands. This was not just cartography, it was political myth-making. For European readers, many of whom had never imagined powerful African kingdoms, this image suggested something extraordinary. Africa was not just land, it was empire. Africa was not just exotic, it was wealthy. Africa, especially Mali, was a source of gold and therefore of interest. This image lodged itself into the European imagination, and from there, it would help drive exploration, trade, and eventually colonization. It is no stretch to say that Portuguese explorers in the 15th century, sailing down the West African coast, were driven in part by the memory of Mansa Musa's gold. They sought the source of that wealth. They hoped to tap into it, trade for it, and eventually control it. A reputation with consequences. Musa didn't intend to turn Mali into a legend. He didn't seek to tempt explorers or redraw world maps. He went on pilgrimage out of faith, not ambition. But because his pilgrimage became so spectacular, his reputation became something no African ruler could escape. Even centuries later, European travelers and colonizers referenced the tales of golden empires. They came looking not just for trade, but for treasure. The myth of Africa as a vault of riches, just waiting to be unlocked, persisted through the Renaissance and into the modern age. This had two major consequences: opportunity and exchange. Musa's story inspired genuine curiosity and trade. It helped shape early relations between West African kingdoms and Portuguese, Spanish, and Moroccan merchants. Mali's successors, like the Songhai Empire, also benefited from this international interest. Greed and exploitation. But it also laid the groundwork for exploitation. Once gold was associated with Africa's interior, foreign powers began devising ways to extract it, often through unequal trade, forced labor, and later, colonization. Musa's generosity had made Mali famous, but fame is a kind of exposure, and not all who seek wealth come in peace. Inside Mali, the long-term effects. What of Mali itself? Economically, Musa's dispersal of gold didn't bankrupt the empire. Mali had more than enough to absorb the loss, but the act did set off a subtle shift. Gold mining expanded, particularly in Bambuk and Bure, increasing labor demands. Foreign merchants arrived, sometimes disrupting local economies with new expectations and prices. Mali's cities grew more cosmopolitan, but also more vulnerable to outside influence. Culturally, the pilgrimage deepened Mali's Islamic identity, but it also created a permanent benchmark. Future rulers would be compared to Musa, often unfavorably. His story became a high point, a golden standard that successors could not always match. In this way, his economic impact extended far beyond Cairo. It shaped Mali's trajectory, its image, and even its downfall. The irony of intention. It is perhaps the deepest irony that a man who gave too much in devotion became a symbol for wealth itself. Musa did not hoard gold. He did not demand tribute from Cairo. He gave, and in giving, he distorted. He went to Mecca out of piety, and along the way recalibrated global understanding of what Africa was and what it could be. And in the markets of Cairo, where the value of goods shifted daily, where the dinar dipped and struggled to recover, that lesson was felt in coin and grain, not just in story. So, what can we learn from the economics of excess? That too much of even a good thing can become a problem. That intentions don't always control outcomes. And that sometimes history is shaped not by conquest, but by a caravan, a prayer, and an open hand overflowing with gold. Story 5, Silent Archives, the Scholars of Timbuktu. There is a silence in the desert that is not emptiness. It is the silence of pages turning, of pens scratching parchment, of voices repeating Arabic verses under their breath. It is the sound of learning, quiet, methodical, and ancient. This is Timbuktu. Not the Timbuktu of myth, a faraway land used to mean the end of the world, but the real city, the intellectual jewel of the Sahel, a place built not of marble but of mud brick, not gilded halls but sun-baked libraries. And it was here, far from Cairo or Baghdad or Mecca, that knowledge was preserved, copied, debated, and carried across generations. In this story, we follow the lives of the scholars of Timbuktu, men, and sometimes women, who wrote in the margins of time, who left behind thousands of manuscripts, many still being uncovered, read, and understood today. This is the story of Africa's paper empire, a city born of trade, grown on ideas. Timbuktu began, like many great cities, as a camp. Around the 11th century, it was a seasonal settlement used by Tuareg nomads and Bozo fishermen. Strategically placed near the Niger River and on the edge of the Sahara, it grew as a natural stopover for caravans moving salt, gold, and ivory. By the time of Mansa Musa's reign in the early 14th century, Timbuktu was already flourishing. After his pilgrimage, Musa invested in the city's infrastructure. He commissioned mosques and brought back scholars and architects from Cairo and Mecca. Over the next century, under the support of both the Mali and later Songhai empires, Timbuktu transformed into a center of Islamic scholarship. But its power wasn't military, it was archival. The University of Sankore. The heart of Timbuktu's learning was the Sankore Mosque, originally built in the 12th century and later transformed into a university. But university here must be understood in its Islamic sense, not a single campus, but a network of scholars, classrooms, and texts held together by tradition and trust. Students came from across West Africa, traveling for weeks or months to study. Quranic interpretation, tafsir. Islamic law, fiqh. Arabic grammar and rhetoric. Astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. History and philosophy. Classes were held in mosque courtyards, under acacia trees, or in the homes of teachers. Learning was oral but increasingly textual. Students copied books by hand, memorized lines, and debated meaning. Completion of study was marked not by a certificate, but by a teacher's approval and a license to teach, ijaza. Timbuktu's scholars weren't isolated clerics. They were deeply engaged in the world. They issued legal judgments for merchants and rulers. They acted as diplomatic advisors. They taught in multiple languages, Arabic for formal discourse, but also Songhai, Tamashek, Fulfulde, and Bambara. And they wrote. The manuscripts. The greatest legacy of Timbuktu's scholars is not in their sermons, but in their books. Tens of thousands of manuscripts have been preserved, some in leather-bound volumes, others hidden in clay jars, secret chambers, or passed down through family lineages. Subjects range from Islamic theology and jurisprudence, philosophy and ethics, grammar and poetics, mathematics and astronomy, medicine and pharmacology, commerce, taxation and contracts, personal letters and travel accounts. The manuscripts are written in classical Arabic, but many include Ajami African languages written using Arabic script. Marginal notes often contain personal commentary, corrections, or jokes. A student might scrawl, "I was tired today," but tried to focus in the margin of a long treatise. Some books are illuminated with geometric designs, while others are simple and worn. The paper came from as far as Egypt, Syria, or Spain, evidence of Timbuktu's deep integration into the Islamic world. And many of these books are unique. They preserve local interpretations, regional customs, and unrecorded histories. They are the voice of West Africa written in ink, not just sung in verse. The scholars themselves. Among the most famous was Ahmed Baba, 1556–1627, a prolific writer and jurist who authored over 40 books, including legal opinions, biographies, and linguistic treatises. Ahmed Baba studied and taught at Sankore, was imprisoned and exiled to Marrakesh by Moroccan invaders who looted Timbuktu in 1591, defended the dignity of West African Muslims, arguing against racist assumptions in North African scholarship, was praised in both West Africa and the Maghreb as a scholar of great depth and clarity. But he was only one voice among many. There were female scholars too often less visible in the record, but mentioned in chains of transmission and household archives. Women sometimes served as Quranic teachers, especially in early education, and some became known for their memorization and commentary on hadith. Scholarship in Timbuktu was not restricted to clerics. Wealthy merchant families maintained libraries and financed the training of their children in both commercial arithmetic and Islamic law. This intellectual culture created a society where scholarship was prestige. Owning books was a sign of status. Donating a manuscript to a mosque was a form of religious charity. The copying of books was an industry one that sustained scribes, bookbinders, and paper importers. The silence that followed. But as with the caravans, the golden age faded. In 1591, the Moroccan invasion under Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur shattered Timbuktu's political autonomy. Scholars were arrested, libraries were looted, manuscripts were carried north to Fez and Marrakesh. The city never fully recovered. It remained a place of learning, but the flow of books slowed, the sponsorships dried up, and the pressure of colonialism, war, and shifting trade routes pushed Timbuktu into obscurity. And yet the books remained. Kept in wooden trunks, clay walls, or beneath floorboards, they were preserved by families who understood their value, passed down quietly without fanfare. Some were forgotten, others were recited by candlelight, a few were smuggled out during modern conflicts to prevent destruction. A legacy unfolding. In the 21st century, efforts began to recover, digitize, and translate Timbuktu's manuscripts. Projects by institutions in Mali, South Africa, and Europe have helped preserve this fragile archive. Thousands of manuscripts have been cataloged. Digital libraries have been established to protect against physical loss. Scholars have found mathematical proofs, astronomical calculations, and philosophical debates centuries ahead of their time. And yet the work continues. Many manuscripts remain unread, undeciphered, undiscovered, waiting for new scholars to revive them. Timbuktu's story is not one of gold or conquest. It is the story of a city built on silence, the silence of study, of ink drying, of minds wrestling with meaning. And so we're left with this question. How many voices from history still lie unread in languages we've forgotten, in pages we've ignored, in places we've never thought to look? If you listened closely in 15th century Timbuktu, the loudest thing in the city might have been the quiet. Not silence in the empty sense, but the stillness of study, the calm concentration of manuscript copyists, the whisper of students reciting passages, and the rhythmic scratching of inked reeds across parchment. It was a city not of shouts or swords, but of pens. In this section, we follow the daily life of Timbuktu's scholars, what they read, how they taught, how they lived. Far from royal palaces or caravan riches, the heartbeat of the city pulsed in courtyards, libraries, and humble homes, where knowledge was both currency and devotion. A day in the life of a scholar. Imagine the morning light hitting the flat rooftops of the city. The mud brick homes still hold the coolness of night, and already students are arriving. Some sit beneath the eaves of mosques, others crowd into the shaded interior of their teacher's home. The teacher, perhaps a respected jurist in his 60s, sits on a mat. He may wear a white turban and simple robes. Around him, Bundles of books, scrolls, reed pens, ink made of soot and gum Arabic, and scrap paper for notes. He begins the lesson with a recitation of the Quran, or perhaps a line of Maliki legal text, such as the Muqtasar of Khalil ibn Ishaq. Students echo his words, commit them to memory, then discuss meanings. Some write, others simply listen. A few of the more advanced pupils debate cautiously. In this world, knowledge is revered, but debate is a sign of mastery. Disagreement, when framed respectfully, is not rebellion, it's scholarship. Midday, the students scatter to perform Zuhr prayer. Some return. Others go to work in the markets or assist in their families' businesses. Study and life are intertwined. Learning is not institutionalized in the modern sense. It is personal, communal, woven into the fabric of daily living. In the afternoon, manuscript copying begins. A student reads from a master text while the others copy. It is slow, deliberate, and devotional. A small error can lead to misunderstanding of divine law. Calligraphy is not just artistry, it is responsibility. Copying and preserving knowledge. In Timbuktu, a single book could take months to copy. The work was done mostly by hand. Ink was mixed using soot, local dyes, or imported pigments. Paper was imported often from Egypt, Morocco, or even Italy. Reed pens were sharpened by hand and discarded when worn. Copyists trained for years, learning not only penmanship but the art of marginal annotation. Many manuscripts include personal notes, corrections, alternative opinions, even diary-like entries such as, "This was copied in the month of Rajab during the rainy season. My brother fell ill, but praise be to God, he is better." These notes remind us, these were people, not just pages. Scribes often included the name of their teacher, the date, and even the conditions of the copying process, offering historians a rare glimpse into the lived experiences behind the text. The book as a status symbol. In Timbuktu, to own books was to own power. Wealthy merchant families invested in building private libraries. It wasn't uncommon for a prominent scholar or judge to own hundreds of books, carefully cataloged, copied by students or purchased from travelers. Some libraries were kept in wooden trunks, others in clay wall niches within family homes. Books were often inherited, gifted, or given as dowries. They weren't just intellectual property, they were economic and social assets. Certain families became known as guardians of texts, with their children trained to recite, explain, and eventually teach from those works. In this way, knowledge was both preserved and passed down, not institutionally, but through family and community lineages. Even as West African societies valued oral tradition, the culture of the manuscript took deep root in Timbuktu, especially among elites and Islamic clerics. This duality, a culture of both memory and text, created a scholarly tradition that was flexible, resilient, and uniquely African. Intellectual currents, what did they study? The curriculum in Timbuktu was wide-ranging, but always grounded in the Islamic tradition, particularly the Maliki school of law, which had deep roots in North and West Africa. Topics included fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, the central subject. Students studied manuals, commentaries, and fatwa collections. Tafsir, Quranic exegesis, how to interpret the holy text, drawing on centuries of precedent. Hadith studies, analyzing the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, and how to determine their authenticity. Grammar and rhetoric, essential for understanding classical Arabic. Logic and philosophy, often drawn from earlier scholars like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Al-Ghazali. Astronomy and mathematics, used for calendar calculations, prayer times, and navigation. Medicine, primarily based on Greco-Arabic texts by figures like Hippocrates, Galen, and Ibn Sina, interpreted through Islamic medical frameworks. But what made Timbuktu special? was not what it studied, it was how that knowledge was adapted to local needs. Legal texts included rulings on local customs, such as bride prices, land disputes, and trade routes. Astronomical texts were used to track the West African rainy seasons. Medical books included notes about regional herbs, suggesting a blend of Islamic knowledge with indigenous healing practices. Timbuktu was not mimicking Cairo or Baghdad. It was creating its own hybrid intellectual culture grounded in global Islam, but rooted in local experience. Scholarly networks across the desert. Timbuktu's scholars were not isolated. They were part of a larger world. Through trans-Saharan trade, they communicated with scholars in Fez, Cairo, Tunis, and Mecca. Letters were carried by merchants. Manuscripts were exchanged as gifts. Some scholars traveled for the Hajj, studied abroad, and returned to teach. There were even fatwas, legal opinions, issued in response to questions from Mali and Songhai that ended up circulated in North African cities. Likewise, West African scholars cited and responded to scholars from across the Islamic world, a transcontinental conversation in ink. This intellectual exchange helped solidify Timbuktu's reputation not just as a curiosity, but as a legitimate seat of learning, on par with Islamic centers in the Middle East and North Africa. Threats to the tradition. But it was a fragile system. In 1591, the Moroccan invasion under Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur led to the sacking of Timbuktu. Many scholars were exiled, killed, or forced into silence. Libraries were looted, and precious manuscripts carried across the desert. Political instability made travel dangerous, disrupting the flow of trade and ideas. In the centuries that followed, European colonialism, Islamic reformist movements, and local conflicts further eroded the infrastructure of scholarship. And yet the books remained. They were hidden, stored, protected, because even when rulers fall and cities change hands, texts endure, especially when guarded by communities who understand their worth. So we return to the question: what kind of power is preserved not in armies or gold, but in the quiet discipline of ink on paper? Timbuktu's legacy is not carved in stone or forged in steel. It exists in something far more fragile: thin, weathered pages, brittle palm leaf paper, fatting ink from centuries past. And yet this city of manuscripts, this Saharan sanctuary of scholarship, has survived centuries of upheaval, invasion, colonization, neglect, and even deliberate destruction. The story of Timbuktu's scholars doesn't end in the 17th century. It continues, quietly and defiantly, into the modern world. This final section explores how Timbuktu's vast intellectual heritage was preserved, what has been lost, and what it means for the future of African historical memory. Preservation through family and faith. After Timbuktu's political decline in the 17th century, state support for scholarship waned. But the manuscripts didn't disappear. Instead, they were absorbed into private life. Families that had once run madrasas and libraries kept their books in wooden chests, clay walls, or hidden corners of their homes. These books were not dusty trophies, they were living documents. In many households, a manuscript might be consulted for. Legal disputes within the family. Guidance on agricultural rituals or seasonal prayers. Medical remedies passed down through generations. Moral advice embedded in Islamic teachings. The manuscripts became a symbol of family prestige. Some families would show them to guests, handle them only with clean hands, and read passages aloud during special gatherings. In this way, the scholar's lineage became the scholar's library. In Timbuktu, knowledge was no longer held in public institutions, it was defended in private homes, passed from parent to child. A new threat: colonialism and neglect. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as French colonial rule extended over West Africa, Timbuktu's manuscripts faced a new kind of danger, not one of burning or looting, but of dismissal. Colonial administrators often viewed African cultures as oral, illiterate, and ahistorical. They believed history in sub-Saharan Africa began only with European contact. Timbuktu's library stood as quiet contradictions to this narrative, but they were largely ignored. Many manuscripts were damaged by neglect, their caretakers under pressure from poverty, war, or displacement. Others were taken abroad to museums in Paris, London, or Madrid, often without consent, listed as curiosities or Islamic artifacts rather than African heritage. But even in obscurity, the books endured. By the mid-20th century, African scholars and international researchers began rediscovering Timbuktu's archives. In the 1960s and 70s, governments and universities in Mali, Senegal, and Nigeria began supporting cataloging and conservation efforts. Suddenly, the world began to understand. These weren't just religious texts. They were legal, scientific, poetic, historical, and philosophical treasures, a written record of an intellectual tradition that spanned centuries and crossed continents. The 21st century crisis, war and resistance. In 2012, a new threat arose. Armed Islamist groups associated with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, took control of northern Mali, including Timbuktu. These groups sought to impose a strict interpretation of Sharia law, and they saw Timbuktu's Sufi heritage and scholarly past as heretical. Fear swept the city. There were rumors of library burnings, of manuscript destruction, of another cultural cleansing like the Taliban's demolition of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. But something remarkable happened. Led by local librarian and historian Dr. Abdul Qadir Haidara, thousands of manuscripts were smuggled out of Timbuktu hidden in suitcases, rice sacks, crates, and metal trunks. These precious texts were transported by car, boat, donkey, and even by hand, sometimes over hundreds of miles to the capital, Bamako. It was a massive, coordinated effort, carried out by librarians, scholars, and ordinary residents, executed in secrecy, under threat of arrest or worse, preserving over 300,000 manuscripts, according to estimates. The world took notice. International organizations rushed to support conservation. Foundations funded digitization projects, while local teams built climate-controlled storage facilities to protect the fragile documents. Once again, Timbuktu's knowledge was saved not by armies or empires, but by its people. Reading the past, rewriting the narrative. Today, scholars around the world are studying Timbuktu's manuscripts not just as artifacts, but as texts with active voices. They are reshaping how we understand African history. The idea that West Africa was an intellectual backwater is being overturned. Timbuktu proves otherwise. Islam in Africa. The manuscripts reveal a version of Islam that is deeply Africanized, blending Arabic scholarship with local languages, customs, and wisdom. Global intellectual history. Timbuktu's texts engage with debates from as far away as Persia, Andalusia, and Cairo, proving that Africa was part of the global scholarly conversation. And perhaps most importantly, the manuscripts teach us how resilient knowledge can be. They have survived termites, fire, water, war, and neglect, and they continue to speak. In one manuscript, a scholar writes, "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." And in Timbuktu, for centuries, that belief wasn't just metaphor, it was practice. A quiet revolution. Today, digital archives are bringing Timbuktu's manuscripts to the world. Projects led by institutions in Mali, Germany, South Africa, and the US are cataloging texts, translating them, and building online platforms. Students in Bamako and Boston can now read the same text, perhaps a legal ruling issued in 1440, or a poem praising a 16th century Sufi saint. And young Malians are being trained to become conservators, translators, and scholars, ensuring the legacy is not just protected, but expanded. For Timbuktu, this is a kind of revolution. Not loud, not violent, but deeply transformative. A city long written off as ruined is now reclaiming its voice through the words of its ancestors. Final reflections. Timbuktu's story is not just about books, it is about what books represent. Memory passed from hand to hand. Wisdom stored not in stone, but in something far more delicate. Resistance in the form of silence, study, and survival. The scholars of Timbuktu may not have marched with armies. They didn't conquer lands or hoard gold, but they preserved a civilization line by line, leaf by leaf, word by word. They remind us that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by the patient, the thoughtful, and the devoted. And so we ask, what knowledge have we forgotten to protect not because it was loud, but because it was quiet? Story 6. The Forgotten Queens of Kush. When most people think of pyramids, they imagine the Giza Plateau, pharaohs, and the grand dynasties of ancient Egypt. But farther south, deep within present-day Sudan, another kingdom built its own pyramids, smaller, steeper, and more numerous. This was the kingdom of Kush, centered in the city of Meroe and ruled often by women. These women were known by the title Candake, sometimes spelled Candace, a royal designation, not a name. They weren't just consorts or mothers, they were sovereigns. Queens who led armies, negotiated with Rome, managed vast trade networks, and ruled over a Nubian African civilization for centuries. Their names are largely forgotten. Their stories lie buried under sand, misidentified in records, or passed over by historians more interested in male pharaohs and emperors. But the queens of Kush governed a realm that challenged Egyptian domination, brokered international alliances, and left behind pyramids, temples, and inscriptions still being uncovered today. We examine the rise of Meroe, the structure of royal authority, and the emergence of the Candake tradition. Through ancient carvings and classical accounts, we begin to reconstruct a quiet but powerful matriarchal tradition in the heart of Africa. Meroe, capital of the southern Nile. The kingdom of Kush had several capitals over its long life: Kerma, Napata, and finally Meroe. Meroe emerged as the dominant city around the 6th century BCE, located near the east bank of the Nile, where the river meets iron-rich hills and savanna woodlands. This was a strategic choice. The area was rich in iron ore, allowing for weapon and tool production; hardwood forests, useful for smelting; agricultural lands, thanks to Nile floods and seasonal rains; trade routes connecting sub-Saharan Africa with Egypt, the Red Sea, and even the Mediterranean. Meroe became a cosmopolitan hub, fusing Egyptian religious practices, African artistic motifs, Greco-Roman diplomacy, and local Nubian traditions. Its rulers built pyramids, dozens of them, over 200 in total. They are narrower and steeper than Egyptian pyramids, and though many have been damaged, they remain standing in rows outside the city, their stones still echoing with the weight of royal history. But unlike Egypt, where women were usually consorts or co-regents at best, Meroe saw the institutionalization of female rule. The Candake, a royal office. The word Candake, or Candace, from Greek sources, denoted a queen mother or ruling queen regnant of Kush. It wasn't a personal name, it was a title, like Pharaoh or Caesar. What's remarkable is that the Candake had real political power. She could issue orders independently. She appeared on coins and stelae. She led troops into battle or sent generals in her name. She often co-ruled with a male king, sometimes her son, sometimes a prince, but her authority was distinct. Classical sources, especially Greek and Roman writers, mention these women with a mix of awe and confusion. To them, A black African queen commanding armies was strange, but undeniable. Greco-Roman encounters, a candidate versus Caesar Augustus. One of the most famous mentions of a candidate appears in Roman records. In 23 BCE, not long after the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, Roman forces pushed south into Nubia. They met fierce resistance. The Roman historian Strabo describes a one-eyed queen named Candace who led the defense of her territory against Rome. This queen likely refers to Ammoniernas, one of the most well-documented candidates. Ammoniernas reigned from approximately 40 BCE to 10 BCE. Was visually impaired, one eye lost in battle, possibly. Led military campaigns against Roman-occupied Egypt. Attacked and captured several Roman garrisons in Aswan, bringing back bronze statues of Caesar Augustus as trophies. Ultimately negotiated peace with Rome, a rare feat, and secured autonomy for Kush without paying tribute. Roman sources describe her as bold, determined, and masculine in her bravery, a common framing used for powerful women in the ancient world. But Ammoniernas was not a one-off. She represented a lineage of warrior queens who ruled in succession, often for decades at a time. Governance and society under the Candaces. What did a Candake reign actually look like? While our knowledge is incomplete, archaeological and inscriptional evidence suggests the Candake oversaw religious rituals, often portrayed offering sacrifices to Amun or Isis in temple reliefs. She was responsible for succession planning. Her son or brother might co-rule with her, or take the throne upon her death. She managed tribute collection, taxation, and trade, especially the movement of gold, ivory, slaves, and iron tools. She exercised control over temple construction, inscriptions, and land grants. She was a diplomat, corresponding with Egyptian, Roman, and Arabian leaders. Importantly, the Candake seems to have been semi-divine in status. Like pharaohs in Egypt, she was not simply a ruler but a cosmic mediator, responsible for the balance between gods and the living. The symbolism on her regalia reflects this. In art, Candakes are shown wearing lion skins and elaborate crowns, holding scepters, ankhs, and other divine symbols, towering over prisoners and enemies, even in reliefs carved by later kings. This was a society where royal women were central, not peripheral. Women's status in Kushite society. The presence of ruling queens suggests a broader cultural respect for women's leadership. While commoners' lives are less documented, we do know women in Meroitic society could own property. Inscriptions name priestesses and female scribes. Some elite women were buried in pyramids, complete with goods and personal items. Female deities such as Isis and Amunet were commonly worshipped. All of this suggests that the role of the Candake was not an anomaly. It emerged from long-standing traditions of female authority in the Nile Valley. This wasn't a matriarchy in the modern sense, but it was a monarchy that valued maternal and feminine power in a way distinct from Egypt or Rome. Pyramids of sand and silence. Today, the royal necropolises of Mera and Napata still stand. Wind-scoured and sun-bleached, many are damaged, some by 19th-century looters like Giuseppe Ferlini, who blew the tops off pyramids searching for treasure. Inside these structures, archaeologists have found inscriptions in Meroitic script, an ancient alphabet still not fully deciphered. Burial goods, beads, pottery, weapons, and gold. Murals depicting Candakes in ritual poses, receiving offerings from the gods. But many of these stories remain fragmentary. The sands have buried more than gold. They've covered lineages, languages, and legacies. The names of many Candakes are known only through partial records. Ammoniernas, Ammonishakib, Shanagdakib, Ammonitor. Each reigned with power, each helped shape Kush, and each remains understudied even as modern researchers try to bring their stories back into view. A question in the dust. In the grand historical imagination, why have these queens remained in the background? Is it because they were African, because they were women, because their language is not yet fully translated? Or is it simply because they ruled quietly without monuments the size of Giza, without the self-aggrandizing scrolls of Roman emperors, without the armies of scribes to sing their praise? Whatever the reason, the silence is not absence, it is a waiting room. A Candake waits, even now, in a ruined tomb or a broken inscription, for someone to read her name aloud again. The sands of Nubia remember. While monuments crumble and scripts lie undeciphered, the desert still bears the faint scars of queens who stood firm against the world's greatest powers. These women were not just symbolic rulers or passive figureheads. They wielded power military, economic, spiritual, and often in times of crisis. In this section, we examine two of the most renowned Candakes, Ammoniernas, the lion queen who faced off against Rome, and Ammonitor, the prolific builder whose reign marked a high point of Kushite civilization. Together, they illustrate how the Candace tradition evolved from a familial title into a powerful institution, carving space for female rule in a world largely dominated by men. Ammoniernas, the warrior queen of resistance. We begin with Ammoniernas, possibly the most celebrated Candake in the historical record. Her story is preserved primarily through the writings of Strabo and Roman military annals, accounts not always sympathetic, but nonetheless detailed. Ammoniernas ruled from around 40 BCE to 10 BCE, during the volatile transition period following Rome's annexation of Egypt. With the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the death of Cleopatra, Egypt came under the direct control of Caesar Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Mara long engaged in border skirmishes and tributary arrangements, with Egypt suddenly found itself facing a massive imperial machine. Rome moved quickly to secure the Nile frontier, but they underestimated the Kushites and their queen. In 24 BCE, Ammoniernas launched a bold invasion of Roman-held Egypt. Her troops captured Aswan, looted Roman outposts, and famously defaced or removed statues of Augustus. One such statue was taken back to Mara and buried beneath the steps of a temple, a symbolic act of dominion. Roman counterattacks followed. Gaius Petronius, the Roman governor of Egypt, launched a brutal campaign into Nubia. He destroyed several Kushite towns and reached Napata, the former capital. But Ammoniernas refused to yield. She regrouped her forces and pushed back, eventually reaching a stalemate. Neither side could secure full victory. In the end, a peace treaty was signed in 20 BCE, a rare occurrence in Roman foreign relations. The terms were surprisingly favorable to Kush. No annual tribute was required. Rome withdrew from key positions along the frontier. Kush retained control over important regions near the Nile's third cataract. Ammoniernas had secured not just peace, but diplomatic parity with one of the world's greatest empires. Iconography of power, Candakes in art. Ammoniernas appears in reliefs and temple carvings, sometimes depicted wielding a sword or towering over bound captives. These images are not fantasy, they are political statements. In a particularly vivid depiction at Musawar at Sufra, a Candake stands beside a lion, representing both royal might and divine protection. Other reliefs show queens participating in temple rites usually reserved for kings in Egypt, suggesting the fusion of political and spiritual power. These visual cues are important. In Kush, symbolic authority was embodied. The Candake had to appear larger than life not just to her subjects, but to the gods. And in every aspect of statecraft, she delivered that image. Ammonitor, builder of temples, restorer of Marae. Ruling approximately from 50 CE to 90 CE, Ameneter presided over what many scholars consider the golden age of Meroe. If Ammoniernas was the warrior queen, Ameneter was the patron of peace, prosperity, and construction. Her reign is noted for extensive temple restoration, particularly in Meroe and Naka, the construction or renovation of over 200 pyramids, temples, and palaces, the flourishing of Meroitic script, a still undeciphered language written in both cursive and hieroglyphic forms. Ameneter's monuments bear her image prominently. She often appears alongside her co-regent, Natakamani, possibly her son or nephew, but inscriptions and reliefs suggest that she held equal, if not superior, authority. One striking example is the Lion Temple of Naka, where she is portrayed in full regalia, holding the crook and flail, symbols of kingship, with the sun disk of Amun-Ra crowning her head. Unlike many ruling pairs in history, Ameneter and Natakamani seem to have ruled in true partnership, but it was Ameneter whose name appeared first in temple inscriptions. This subtle ordering implies precedence, a sign of her status as senior sovereign. Daily life under the Kandaks. While palace life remains obscure, inscriptions, artifacts, and comparative studies help paint a picture of life under the Kandaks for their subjects. Trade was vibrant, with Meroe acting as a node between Central Africa, Egypt, and Arabia. Ivory, incense, animal hides, and gold were major exports. Crafts flourished, especially pottery, metalwork, and jewelry. Female artisans are mentioned in some records. Religion centered around Amun, adapted from Egyptian theology but expressed in uniquely Nubian ways. Priests often reported directly to the queen. Education was reserved for elites, but writing in Meroitic script suggests a bureaucratic infrastructure, likely staffed by scribes, some of whom may have been women. Ameneter's reign also oversaw a revival of public works wells, irrigation systems, and temple complexes. The wealth of the kingdom appears to have been redistributed through ritual, construction, and patronage, much like in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. The dimming of a dynasty. The tradition of powerful Kandaks seems to have declined after the 3rd century CE. The reasons remain unclear. Possibilities include economic decline. Shifting trade routes may have bypassed Meroe. Environmental degradation. Deforestation and overuse of iron smelting furnaces damaged the local ecosystem. Internal conflict or succession crises. Evidence is fragmentary, but inscriptions become scarcer. Rise of Aksum. A rival kingdom in present-day Ethiopia, Aksum eventually conquered parts of Kush around 350 CE, marking the end of Meroe's supremacy. Still, the memory of the Kandaks endured in Christian Ethiopian chronicles. Arab oral traditions and Greco-Roman writings often distorted, but never fully erased. And even as pyramids fell into ruin, their presence testified to a time when black queens ruled a kingdom of iron, ink, and lions. A thread in a larger tapestry. The Kandaks of Kush were not isolated phenomena. Across Africa, women have historically held power in matrilineal societies as priestesses, warriors, and rulers. But the Candace tradition stands out for its formalization. It was institutional, not exceptional. These queens didn't rule in a crisis. They ruled as part of a recognized political system. Their story forces us to rethink ancient leadership. What does it mean when a society recognizes maternal authority in government? How does female rule reshape national identity? Why were these figures erased or ignored in so many historical narratives? In their silence, the Kandaks pose a challenge. History must be sought, not assumed. And power, when buried, does not disappear, it waits to be recognized. The pyramids of Meroe rise from the desert like broken teeth, jagged, silent, mysterious. Many are damaged, some looted, and others stand partially buried under layers of sand. Few travelers pass this way, and fewer still realize that these ruins mark the tombs of Africa's warrior queens. The Candakes, rulers of the Kingdom of Kush, have long been veiled by the passage of time. Yet they are not lost. We explore how archaeologists, linguists, and historians are recovering the stories of these forgotten queens, and why their legacies are more relevant today than ever before. From the lingering mystery of the Meroitic script to modern African feminism, the Candakes offer a powerful reminder that women have always led, even when the world has forgotten. Rediscovering Kush, 19th and 20th century expeditions. Though European travelers had long noted the presence of ruins in Nubia, systematic exploration of Kushite civilization didn't begin until the early 19th century. Much of the early attention was drawn by the unusual pyramids of Meroe, unlike anything seen in Egypt. In the 1830s, an Italian treasure hunter named Giuseppe Ferlani dynamited the tops off many pyramids, searching for gold. He found some, notably in the tomb of Queen Amenishikheto, whose exquisite jewelry ended up in museums in Berlin and Munich. But he destroyed irreplaceable royal tombs in the process. More scientific efforts followed. In the 20th century, archaeologists such as George A. Reisner and later Sudanese and German teams conducted more respectful excavations, documenting hundreds of pyramids, temples, and inscriptions. Through these efforts, researchers discovered that the rulers of Meroe used a unique script Meroitic distinct from Egyptian hieroglyphs. There were royal burial traditions distinct to Kush, including double burials and specific grave goods. Queen names like Amenirnas, Amenitter, and Shanakdakhet appeared repeatedly in temple inscriptions. But much remains undeciphered. Meroitic is one of the few ancient scripts for which scholars have a basic phonetic understanding, but no dictionary the vocabulary remains elusive, and without a Rosetta Stone, the full meaning of many inscriptions is still speculative. We have the names of queens. We can see their images, their architecture, and their legacy, but their voices, their poetry, laws, personal reflections remain largely silent. The pyramids speak softly. Outside of Egypt, no region in Africa has more pyramids than Sudan. The cemeteries at Meroe, Napata, and Nuri contain over 300 pyramid structures, most of them belonging to kings, queens, and elite nobility of the Kushite period. The tombs of the Candakes are among the most fascinating. They often contain carvings of queens in regal poses, receiving offerings or smiting enemies, funerary texts in Meroitic script, gold jewelry, including amulets, rings, and crowns, especially in tombs like that of Amenishikheto, weapons and regalia, suggesting their martial role. These pyramids are now protected as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, though preservation remains a challenge due to looting, erosion, and lack of funding. Still, each tomb excavated, each inscription documented, brings us closer to understanding a culture that flourished for over 1,000 years, and whose women ruled with both strength and spirituality. The Candakes and the construction of historical memory. Why then have the Candakes been so overlooked? Several overlapping forces contributed. Colonial historiography. 19th century European historians tended to dismiss African civilizations as peripheral to world history. Egypt was studied intensely, but Kush was often seen as a copycat or secondary culture. Gender bias. Female rulers throughout history have been marginalized. Even Cleopatra, far better known, was often portrayed through a lens of seduction rather than statecraft. The Candakes, having ruled without male counterparts, confounded patriarchal expectations. Linguistic barriers. The failure to decipher Meroitic script has made deep understanding of Kush's internal affairs difficult. Without letters, speeches, or records in translation, their reigns remain elusive. Geopolitical marginalization. Sudan's turbulent modern history and lack of tourism infrastructure have made archaeological preservation and public awareness difficult. Yet despite these barriers, interest is growing. Modern Sudanese scholars, African feminists, and global historians are reclaiming the legacy of the Kandaks not as footnotes to Roman history, but as sovereigns in their own right. Kandaks in contemporary culture. In recent years, references to the Kandaks have re-emerged in African and diasporic discourse. You may find documentaries and museum exhibits highlighting Amminirnas's war against Rome. Sudanese feminist writers invoking the Kandaks as symbols of resilience and leadership. Artists and designers drawing from Kushite regalia in fashion, jewelry, and visual art. Afrofuturist works imagining ancient African queens as part of a broader global mythology. In 2020, Sudan's transitional government even discussed restoring and digitizing Mehrez archaeological archives, signaling a renewed commitment to national heritage. The Kandaks are no longer invisible. They are being reinscribed into history, not as novelties, but as foundational figures in African civilization. Reflections on power, gender, and memory. What can we learn from these ancient queens? That female authority is not a modern invention. That African history is not monolithic, nor is it limited to oral tradition. That resilience can come in the form of treaty negotiation, temple building, and spiritual stewardship, not just warfare. The Kandaks remind us that history is a mosaic, and that every missing tile, every overlooked story distorts the image we pass down. They also raise deeper questions. How many other women have ruled, yet remain unnamed in our books? What are the consequences of silence in the historical record? And who gets to decide which queens are remembered and which are forgotten? The lasting influence. Though the kingdom of Kush eventually fell, its symbols and traditions lived on. The idea of female sovereignty echoed in Ethiopia's Empress Zuditu, centuries later. Its pyramids inspired 20th century Pan-African thinkers, seeking pre-colonial models of black excellence. The title Kandak continues to appear in Ethiopian Christian texts, including the New Testament's Book of Acts, where a royal official from Candace, Queen of the Ethiopians, converts to Christianity, a subtle sign of how far the influence of these queens once reached. Even today, in the cultural consciousness of the African continent, the Kandak is a symbol of strength, matrilineal wisdom, resistance, and beauty. She reminds us that queenship need not be quiet, nor must it wait for permission to rule. Final thought. The silence surrounding the Kandaks was never total. It was simply waiting beneath desert sands, in carved stone, in undeciphered script for someone to listen closely enough. Now that we're listening, the question remains: what other queens have we buried under the weight of someone else's history?